Hi, I'm Julie Levitt-Learson for Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on fashions for the Victorian era. Just a reminder, this time in history is named after Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, so we're covering roughly 1840 to 1900. And something important to think about for this lecture is the innovations of the Industrial Revolution and their impact on fashion. A few things I just want to lift up here. We have lots of advances in manufacturing textiles, fabrics, trims, laces, and accessories. And so fashion becomes easier to obtain and more affordable. We start to develop ready to wear clothing. This is a development out of all things, the American Civil War that brought about the idea of standardized clothing sizes for men because they had to make so many uniforms. Women's wear takes a bit longer, but we are moving away from this idea of custom made outfits for each individual person every time you need an outfit to buying something off the rack that kind of fits. We also have the invention of the sewing machine that by 1870 becomes pretty affordable for most middle class households. So they can be sewing by machine garments at home. Everything heretofore has been hand sewn. So that's a labor saver. We also have the development of fashion magazines where there are images of fashionable clothing and illustration for people to be inspired by, and also the inclusion of garment patterns for people to cut out of the magazine and then sew together to make their own clothes at home. Photography is advancing, so we have a lot more available to us in terms of resources, like you'll see in this slideshow, especially for middle class and working class people who normally don't get their portrait taken. Um, and one other thing to mention is that by mid-century, we have the emergence of the first couture house in Paris. We have Charles Frederick Worth, who's considered the first official fashion designer, where it means he is a professional person who is making his living designing clothing for people to buy, and that his take on what clothing should look like is trend setting in and of itself. This is a new development, and of course, as soon as there's one, many, many more follow. Our last lecture for the Romantic era took us up to right about 1840 when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert. So let's start there for this lecture. You can see on the left a portrait of Victoria and Albert. They are at the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy. On the right-hand side, we have existing garments from about 1850 for a middle-class couple. And I'm assuming these are American wearers, were the original wearers of these outfits because these clothes are from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But you can see the general fashionable shape and style of these garments for this time. We have a definite kind of separation of genders by these clothes. We have a very soft, feminine hourglass shape for women, and we have a rather angular, rectilinear shape for men. You can see also in the textile choices, women's tend to be more decorative, men's tend to be plainer. During this era, men were going out into the workforce. I mean, people have always worked, but they were oftentimes going to an office or to a bank or to, some cases a factory to do their work. Women were expected to stay home. Of course, many women had to work. Poor women had to work, enslaved women had to work, but for middle class and upper class women, her job was to create a restful, tranquil home for the husband to retire to at the end of his tough working day. Starting with menswear for this time period, we really see a separation of clothing rules for what's acceptable for day wear and what's acceptable for evening wear. This is an outgrowth or evolution of this idea of court dress and non-court dress from the last century. So we have this idea that during the daytime you have formal wear, semi-formal wear, casual wear. In the evening, you also have formal wear, semi-formal wear, and casual wear. In addition, because Victorians loved to categorize things, you also have specialty clothing for things like athletic pursuits. This image is a fashion plate from about 1857 from a men's fashion magazine called L'Elegant. Um, you can see these men in day wear attire. And note how menswear has changed from neoclassical and romantic styles. We have a rather less fitted silhouette. We've still got our front coats and tailcoats and long trousers, but pants now are flat front. They don't have that pleating from the Cossack trousers from the last lecture. They're straight legged. And they've lost that strap that goes under the boot. You can see this outfit still consists of coat, pants, waistcoat, shirt, tie, and then shoes and hat, right? We'll get into some of these details more, but you can see that trend towards kind of sober colors, right? But a suit doesn't have to be all pieces being the same fabric. You can kind of mix and match. And there is some differentiation and some pattern mixed in with solid colors here. And you can see almost every man in this illustration is wearing a top hat that is considered correct dress for daytime for men and for evening, actually, in lots of cases. And you can see they're all wearing ties, and outside the house, you're wearing gloves. Underneath all of these layers of clothing, we have men's underwear. It hasn't changed much from previous times. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the union suit. On the left-hand side, you can see a pair of linen drawers from about 1830, 1840. Linen is still very comfortable for underwear. It is being supplanted slowly by cotton, especially in America, where we have really invested in cotton production in the American South, thanks to enslaved labor. However, another alternative to drawers is something called a union suit. This was an invention in the 1860s in Utica, New York, and it's basically, an all-in-one tops and bottoms combined. It was originally made for women, but quickly became popular among men, especially working class men. And they could be made of cotton or linen, occasionally silk if you were wealthy, but wool flannel was also a popular fabric for this, especially in America, in the northern climates where it got very cold, because again, this is an era where we don't have central heating. And red flannel was very popular for union suits for men. They were generally woven material, but eventually were knitted, which was a little bit more comfortable. Um, and men of all classes wore them. On the right-hand side, you can see a photograph of a man in what appears to be a union suit, and he's standing with a boy who is wearing a nightshirt, which is a man's shirt, pretty similar, right? A little fuller cut, no collar on it, and then longer to the knees or below. Men's shirts from this era, they're kind of continuing to evolve subtly. I've got three images here of shirts. These are reproduction 19th century shirts, but you can see the top one's from about 1840, middle one from 1860, and one on the bottom from 1890. Hopefully you can see the changes over time, right? So sleeves start out pretty full and blousy, they get less so. By the time we get to the 1890s, that looks like a pretty contemporary shirt, does it not? The earlier shirts have this bib front, right, where they button down to about halfway down the chest and then stop. So you have to pull the shirt on and off over your head. And then where the buttons are, you have this kind of decorative or kind of enhanced fabric there. These are pleated. They didn't necessarily have to be pleated, but you had this sense of a bib there. And then that was covered up by the waistcoat, and then the rest of the shirt you didn't see, and that was plain. That disappears by the 1890s. And you can see the shirt placket for the 1890 shirt goes all the way down to the bottom, so you don't have to pull the shirt on and off over your head anymore. You can also see that the collar starts out really high, like we talked about in the Romantic era, and it slowly shrinks over time. The 1890 shirt doesn't have a collar on it. That's because oftentimes collars were detachable, which made it easier to launder the shirts and the collars separately because the collars tended to be stiff. And of course, we tend to think of shirts being in white, but they could also be colored, they could be striped, they could have a little pattern on them. And so I've included here on the right-hand side this painting called The Jolly Flatboatman, and you can see men in colored shirts as well as white. And again, cotton is replacing linen, especially in America for fabric for shirts. So looking at men's day wear, I'm showing you examples of existing garments from a few different decades within this period. The changes to men's day wear are pretty subtle, so it doesn't really matter if something here is 1850, 1860, what have you. It's pretty close for our purposes. On the left-hand side, though, you can see a man in a tailcoat from about 1845. This was considered, at the start of the Victorian era, acceptable formal day wear. It quickly became exclusively evening wear to wear a tailcoat. So for the most of the Victorian era, formal day wear would be a frock coat, which you can see here, this tan kind of checked suit in the middle, and then the black frock coat with white pants to the right of it. The outfit on the right-hand side is called a morning coat or a cutaway coat. This is a development from men's riding wear because remember the frock coat has a seam at the waist and then the skirts come down to mid-thigh and can be pretty full. Well, if you're sitting astride a horse, it's pretty impractical to have all those skirts in your way. So the jacket cut curves in towards the chest and then about midway down the chest line curves away again towards the back. And so this very practical solution to horseback riding gets carried over into day wear, and that becomes a less formal day wear choice for men. You can see here with all of these outfits, they're a lot less restrictive than the earlier kind of neoclassical and romantic era. We don't have that super nipped in waist anymore and the big puffy sleeves. Everything is a little bit more streamlined, a little bit boxy. Frock coats can be single-breasted or double-breasted. You'll see examples of both. And as you can see here with all of these outfits, your jacket, your pants, and your vest could all be of the same material. They could be of 2 different materials, or they could be of 3 different materials. The waistcoats can be single-breasted or double-breasted. They can be of different patterns and colors. They can have different variations to the collar shape. But you need to have a waistcoat with your jacket and pants to be considered properly dressed. You also need to be wearing a tie. You can see our man there from 1845 on the left is wearing a neckcloth that looks rather like the neckcloths from the earlier eras, but the rest of them are wearing ties that look a lot like 20th century bow ties and neckties. So the neckcloth remains, but it's getting streamlined and shrunken down. The pants too, as I said before, they become a bit more streamlined, right? They're going to be narrow or wide-legged depending on the fashion impulse of the moment, but they've lost that kind of poofy pleated look of the Cossack trousers, and they're just kind of stovepipes. No creases, no cuffs, they're just rather straight-legged down. And again, when you're outside the home, it is considered correct dress to be wearing a hat and gloves. And you can see most of these mannequins have those. And then sometimes men use a walking stick. And to go along with our images from museums, here are some vintage photographs of men in frock coats. And I think a couple of cutaways as well. So you can really see here, right? They're rather slouchy fitting. They're not at all tight and constrictive like they were in the previous fashion era. So again, you can see different fabrics, different textures. Some are single-breasted, some are double-breasted. The gentleman in the photograph second from the left, I believe that's a frock coat because I can see that waist seam there, but he's only buttoned the top button. That's called the Richmond style. I don't know who Mr. Richmond was who originated that style, but that was considered trendy among young fashionable men. Note also with these men, there's very little jewelry on display here. They might have a pocket handkerchief in their frock coat pocket. They might have a watch chain, they might have a ring, but that's about it for accessories. So if the tailcoat and then the frock coat was formal day wear, and the morning coat or cutaway was semi-formal day wear, we also have informal day wear. This was called the sack suit or the lounge suit, but Not that men were lounging around in these suits. This was considered informal, correct day wear. So men who went to work in an office could wear a sack suit. The sack suit develops up from working class men's smocks. Think about the sans culotte from our neoclassical era. It's a loose fitting, hip length jacket with no waist seam, generally single breasted, although I suppose it could also be double breasted as well. And to go with that casual suit, you have a different kind of hat. So you can see our gentleman here on the top right hand side, he's wearing a bowler hat, which is got a rounded crown as opposed to the cylindrical top hat with a flat top. So that's considered an informal hat to wear. Or if you want to go super casual, you could go with a soft cap, like the working class man in the image on the left hand side is wearing or holding. So you can see the Phrygian cap has shrunk and flattened to become a working man's cap, and that also gets adopted by middle class men for sports. And again, the sack coat could be paired with matching trousers or different trousers. But in either case, you still got to wear a waistcoat that could be of a third fabric or could match one of your other two. But if your job requires physical labor, you might wear a sack suit like these working class men here in this photograph from the late 1800s. You can see they've got the loose hip length jacket, they've got waistcoats on, and they've got the flat caps. But they don't seem to be wearing woolen trousers. They seem to be wearing a much more casual fabric. So let's take a moment to honor the invention of the jeans, right? In 1848, the American Gold Rush created this need for sturdy work pants as the West was being flooded by prospectors and explorers. And so Levi Strauss invented denim jeans. Denim is made from, it's a cotton twill made from one thread being indigo and one thread being white, and they're known for their durability, their comfort. They tend to mold to the body. They move with the body. They're easily washable, and they can take a beating. And so an American staple was born. You can see in this photograph in the middle, these are 49ers prospectors in 1849, and a lot of them are wearing jeans. And on the right-hand side, you can see a photo of an existing pair of denim jeans from about 1840s. It's housed at the Museum of Fashion Technology. The word denim comes from the French city of Nimes, where it was thought that this kind of indigo and cotton twill weave was invented. So denim is Nimes, from Nimes, but that might be a myth. It's certainly become an American iconic fashion staple. But in the 19th century, it is definitely working class male attire. You do not wear jeans to the office.
Moving on to evening wear. Here with evening wear, this is anything from 6 o'clock on in the evening. Generally speaking, people dressed formally for dinner during this time, and formal evening wear attire was still the tailcoat. It kind of gets out of fashion for day wear and becomes the formal coat for evening wear during this century. So black tailcoat with matching trousers was pretty much what you wanted. And you can see several images here, worn with a white shirt with a bib front and with a black or white low-cut waistcoat and with a black tie or a white tie, depending on the formality of the occasion. White tie was more formal, black tie was less formal.
Moving into evening wear, this is an era where people changed their clothes for dinner. So 6 p.m. on, you were wearing a different outfit than what you wore during the day, even if you were staying at home. And again, you have different degrees of formality: formal, semi-formal, and casual. Here is formal men's evening wear. To be considered properly dressed for a formal evening event, you had to be wearing tails. And very, very quickly, by about 1840, it was only acceptable to have black tailcoat with matching black trousers. You would wear this with a white shirt that had that bib detail like I was talking about earlier. You would pair it with a white or a black low-cut waistcoat to show off that bib detail on your shirt. And for a very formal event, you would wear a white bow tie, and for a semi-formal event, you would wear a black bow tie. You would wear black shoes with this. And again, you might have a watch chain, you might have a flower in the buttonhole of your tailcoat, but that was it. So the rules of what is acceptable dress, especially for men, are really tightening down. For less formal evening wear, by the late 1800s, you could wear something called the dinner jacket, what we know as the tuxedo. Rumor has it that this jacket was invented in about 1881 in Tuxedo Park, New York, where a man was about to attend an evening event. He was wearing his tailcoat and some sort of wardrobe malfunction happened and he had to cut or tear the tails of his coat off. Had no other alternative, couldn't call a tailor, so just made the best of it and brazened it out in the dining room. People were scandalized, and then it quickly caught on and became a fashion. So a dinner jacket or a tuxedo, it follows the cut of a tailcoat, but it has no waist seam and no tails. Early on, it tends to curve away at the hip. Later on, it tends to square off and comes down to like that sack jacket, mid-thigh length. But again, everything else about your outfit for evening wear is going to be the same as the tailcoat. Black pants, white shirt, white or black waistcoat, white or black tie. Men did have casual wear for evening in the privacy of their own home, in the company of other men or by themselves. They had smoking jackets or dressing gowns. Smoking jackets arise out of this kind of ritual where at the end of dinner, the men retire from the dining room to the man's study or parlor to smoke and talk about business and have a glass of brandy and do secret guy stuff. I don't even know. And so they would take off their dinner jacket or tailcoat and put on a smoking jacket so that the fumes from their cigars wouldn't get into their dinner jacket or tailcoat, but it would be caught up in the smoking jacket. You can see a couple examples here. They tended to be quite luxurious. We've got a lot of velvet and satin. They might be brocade. They tend to borrow a lot of details from India and China and the Mideast. You can see there on the very right-hand side, at least one man had an entire suit made out of this red velvet for a smoking suit. I can't imagine that caught on amongst many men. But they would have this jacket that they would slip on over their shirt and trousers and call it done. For real informal evening or morning attire in your own home, of course, you have the dressing gown, right? This is the evolution of the banyan from the last century. And again, it just kind of becomes less carefully shaped. Still might be of luxurious fabric, might be of plainer fabric, depending on your economic status and what you can afford. But this was worn over shirt and pants in the privacy of your own bedroom or study where you were not entertaining other people. Remember, there's no central heating in these homes, and so being warm in the evening is important. You pair this with a pair of slippers and you add a nightcap and you're good to go. And for outerwear, men still sometimes wore capes. They were considered more formal. They were considered more for, city living. Increasingly, men were wearing overcoats of different styles, and there's lots of different kinds. There's the Inverness, there's the Chesterfield, blah, blah, blah. They just wore coats. The 19th century also saw this development of sportswear. We had riding coats and hunting outfits in the 18th century, but we're really starting to develop this idea of like when you are engaging in athletic pursuits, you have to wear a whole different outfit. So here are a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, you see a Norfolk jacket. This was named for a Duke of Norfolk. It is developed for hunting and then was adapted for other sports like bicycling, as you can see here. So the jacket is kind of like a sack coat, but it has a wide belt at the waist. You can see some belt loops for it. It's got pockets on the outside. We call those patch pockets. So you can put things like your extra bullets or your fishing flies or, I don't know, small game you managed to catch. Just kidding. And then in the back, it had this kind of pleated section across the center of the back so that you could have greater range of motion when you were firing a gun. So they're worn with these kind of special short pants that get tucked into knee-length boots, and you can stride across the moors shooting at ducks or whatever you're going to be doing. Another kind of specialty sportswear garment is something called the knickerbockers. You can see it here in the illustration and then the photograph on the right-hand side. Knickerbockers, they're the only fashionable short pant of this century, and they're reserved only for athletic pursuits, not suitable for work or social events. Do not, do not, do not. They were probably developed to kind of keep the pant leg out of the spokes of a bicycle when that became a popular pastime for men. So as you can see, they're often made out of the same material as your sack jacket or your Norfolk jacket, but they kind of blouse at the knee, and they're finished with a buckle or a button. And let's take a minute to talk about men's hair during the Victorian era. If you remember the neoclassical and the romantic, men tended to be clean shaven, very short hair in the neoclassical, a little bit more wavy tousled for the romantic. Here, we really kind of open up hairstyle to a wide variety of looks. And here is just the tip of the iceberg we've got going on here. And I've assigned decades to these photographs because that's when these photographs were taken. They're general trends. It doesn't mean that what the gentleman was wearing in 1840 was completely passé by 1850 or what have you, just a general idea. So by the 1840s, whiskers and other forms of facial hair were back in style for the first time in many decades. And the styles and length of the hair and the facial hair varied. In general, the hair is going to be parted on the side and combed across the head or back. It was kept nice and trim above the ears and above the shirt collar. And men used hair oil or pomade to keep their hair and beards looking smooth and shiny. It took a lot of manscaping to get the facial hair the way they wanted, but you can see like sideburns, mutton chops, whiskers, mustaches, beards, goatees, all of the above. In general, it was the 1860s, 1850s, 60s, 70s where beards were really in and big, and by the latter decades of the 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s, beards tended to fall out of fashion, especially among young men, and just have mustaches. But again, huge variety in hairstyle and facial hairstyle. But I hope you're getting a sense of this kind of hardening sense of masculinity that's developing in this era and how it's being expressed through clothing and grooming and style choices for men. That to look properly dressed meant something very different in the 1800s than it did in previous centuries. And choices for what was acceptable for a man to wear and how he was to present himself were getting increasingly narrow. And so, whenever there is a narrowing down of choices, you're going to have a few people that rebel against it. So, welcome the fans of so-called aesthetic dress. These were rule breakers who defied convention on what is proper attire. And I think probably the most famous example of the wearer of aesthetic dress is the playwright Oscar Wilde. You can see a photo of him here in 1882. And he's deliberately defying the rules of correct male attire. So he's wearing knee breeches and silk stockings, which were passé. He's wearing a velvet coat, probably in a vibrant color like blue or purple or something. He's got a very silky tie. His hair is long. His face is clean shaven. He is saying, I don't think that your ideas about masculinity are the end all and be all, and I can be a man and dress this way. And on the right hand side, I've got an example of a velveteen morning coat. You can see that kind of cutaway shape, but it's in velveteen, which would be considered, not manly by this time. And it appears to be in a dark blue, which is getting a little racy for men's attire by this point. So now that we've had a sense of what it means to be masculinely attired in this era, let's shift gears and talk about women's fashions. If you remember where we left off at the end of the Romantic era, this idea of the angel in the house being the ideal for feminine behavior and comportment, that persists. Queen Victoria herself was kind of a proponent of this. Here is a woman that is ruling an empire, yet she kind of portrayed herself as just a wife and mother to the public. Um, and again, as I'd said, it was considered the utmost feminine accomplishment to marry well, have children, and create a welcoming home for the husband to return to after work. Obviously, for a great number of women, that was not attainable, but that was the ideal held out for all women to strive for. I have here this kind of timeline of the fashionable silhouette, one dress for each year for almost the entire of Queen Victoria's reign. And I've put that here just to show you how the fashionable silhouette just undergoes some very rapid, kind of almost constant change during these 6 decades. Um, and it became a job to keep up with these fashion trends, even as menswear is kind of getting a little bit more static, or at least more subtle in what is changing. Women's wear continues to speed up in terms of what is changing. And as we'll discuss in future slides, the foundation garments that go along with this are also changing. Hairstyles are changing with this as well. We left off our last lecture at about 1840, so let's pick up where we left off. Here we can see an example of a day dress and then an example of an evening dress. Portrait on the right is Queen Victoria. Portrait on the left is an unknown woman, I believe American, but I might be mistaken. But as you can see, right, we're just continuing that same silhouette from the end of the Romantic era, where we have a snugly fitted bodice, a slightly raised waist, and then a very full skirt, where the fabric of the skirt is gathered up into the waistband. Very covered up for day wear with a rather high neckline and long sleeves. We have an exposed neckline and exposed arms for evening wear. That off the shoulder look is still in style. For the evening dress, we have that Bertha collar happening. And you can see how the kind of shoulder line for the bodice of the day dress goes off the shoulder. And then we have that full sleeve that's then caught up at a narrow cuff. That's called a bishop sleeve. And here are some examples of typical hairstyles for during this period. On the left, we have, I believe, a middle class family from America. And on the right hand side, we have an upper class set of sisters from Canada. Both are about 1840 to 1845. And we've got day wear on the left and evening wear on the right. So hair is generally going to be smooth and neat. It's parted in the center and pulled back away from the face, no bangs. You can see it's kind of rolled back softly from the face during the day and caught in a bun or knot at the nape of the neck. And then for evening, it might be curled into ringlets that frame the face on either side. And then the rest of it is in a bun at the back. And you can have, jewels or feathers or flowers or ribbons in your hair for evening, but during the day, it tends to be rather plain. Another thing I wanted to mention was that makeup for this era generally considered unladylike and was discouraged. But as you can see here on the right hand side, these girls have lovely roses in their cheeks. They might have pinched their cheeks to make that color appear, or the painter might have invented it, or they might have actually used a little bit of makeup to give that appearance of fresh rosy cheeks. Outerwear for women. Like men, if women left the home, they covered their heads and they put on gloves. Women, particularly middle class, upper class women, were encouraged to keep their skin out of the sun. So paleness was considered a sign of, femininity and, socioeconomic success. So women wore bonnets and caps to shield their faces from the sun. They covered up their necks and shoulders and arms to keep the sun off the skin. Their dresses were rather voluminous to cover with a coat, so they would tend to wear capes or shawls, or like you can see here in this fashion illustration from the Ladies' Gazette, these so-called mantles, which is kind of like shawls with a sleeve to slide your arms into so that you didn't have to worry about it falling off as you walked about. As we move into the 1850s, again, a day wear dress on the left, an evening dress on the right. The silhouette remains Very, very similar for both day and evening, difference being evening dresses have lower necklines and shorter sleeves. Um, you can see those skirts are continuing to get wider. You can see there's a little bit more emphasis on horizontal. We've got tiers of flounces and ruffles on both of these dresses that just further emphasize the circumference of these skirts. And you can see kind of some horizontal style lines, particularly on the day dress with the row of fringe across the bodice and those sleeves. These sleeves that are wide like this that don't get caught up in the cuff, those are called bell sleeves. So you can see the day dress has bell sleeves and then a bishop sleeve underneath. And then the evening dress just has those short kind of puffy sleeves kind of covered by that Bertha. Again, that off the shoulder look is continuing. You can see the style line on the day dress, right? So you can't raise that arm up. And then the off the shoulder collar line of the evening dress. Now to keep these skirts, out and full like this, women are finding that they need to wear an increasing number of petticoats underneath. Petticoats are going to be made of linen or cotton. There might be a wool one, or there might be a silk one in there too. They might have starch added to them to keep the petticoat stiff, to give more structure, to hold these skirts out that are getting heavier with all this volume. And women might be wearing up to a dozen petticoats underneath these dresses. So can you imagine that's getting heavy, that's getting cumbersome, that's getting expensive to launder, and it's probably not comfortable to wear. So we innovate. We develop the cage crinoline or the hoop skirt. Kind of a throwback to the farthingale, but new and improved with 19th century Industrial Revolution technology. Started with whalebone, probably quickly shifted over to steel. And as you can see, this cage crinoline is going to create that rigid structure for the skirts to lay on top of. So you don't need all those petticoats anymore. You're going to wear a petticoat underneath this cage crinoline to keep the steel off your skin, and you're going to wear a petticoat over the cage crinoline to keep it from snagging on your dress and to create a smooth line. But still, that's way less than 12, and so probably much more comfortable. You can also see we've shifted our shape of corset. Again, this is quite a bit shorter below the waistline than the ones from the 1830s, because with this bell skirt that we've got going on, you don't really need to constrict the body below that waistline. But notice how this corset is also quite a bit curvier than stays were in the 18th century or the 16th century, right? It's very rounded over the hips and rounded over the bosom. And again, this is done with a combination of whalebone and steel to give this shape. Important to remember, I didn't include images, but we're familiar by now. Underneath the corset, a woman would wear a linen or increasingly cotton chemise that would just follow the neckline of her gown. And she would probably wear cotton or linen drawers, just like men. Here is a woman's visiting dress, a day dress, worn over a cage crinoline. And so I'm hoping you can see the difference between a skirt with all those fabric petticoats versus a cage crinoline. It's a much more rigid shape, it's much more smooth, and it's going to hold that shape. It's not going to collapse easily. Another thing I want you to notice here is how brightly colored this dress is, this beautiful plaid, the red and the gold and the blue, and then again in her shawl. This is again another technological innovation. Synthetic coal tar dyes have been developed in aniline dyes, and this allows us to get a much wider range of colors and much more intensely hued colors than natural dyes from plants or mollusks or the other kinds of things that we've been using for dyes up to now. The decade of the 1860s, this is often called the crinoline era because this is when the cage crinoline was most popular. This is when the skirts reached their widest circumference. You can kind of see that here with these day dresses. They are pretty wide. Along with these wider skirts, you can see that waistline creeping up to kind of just below the rib cage. Not as high as it was during the Empire period, but still pretty high. And I think that's to better support the cage crinoline, because if it's above your hip bone, then your hip bone acts as a as a break to keep it from falling down. So you can see, again, we've got these smooth panels of fabric that are pleated or folded or gathered into the waistband. That waistband is now kind of like squared off, and it's often in a contrasting color to show off the smallness of the waist or create the illusion of an even smaller waist. Um, the skirt is now so voluminous and large, it might be separate from the bodice, but you still call it a dress when you wear it. Note all of the trim detail on these and how the trim is focused near the hemline, because that's where you can see it the best because the skirt is less pleated at the bottom. Notice on the right hand side, this is a little bolero jacket over a blouse paired with a matching skirt, and that the trim is kind of imitating that 18th century French split skirt look. And the trim is kind of taking on a three-dimensional quality again. We've got braid, we have lace, we have ribbon, and we have what looks like ball fringe on that bolero jacket. And then we're also using buttons as contrasting kind of trim down the front of that dress, that green dress on the left-hand side. Again, evening dresses, basically the same silhouette, but more skin exposed. We still have that kind of basque waistline happening with the evening dresses to really emphasize the tiny waist. You can see the beautiful pleating of these really wide skirts, how to get all of that fabric into a tiny waistline. You do it by pleats and folds. And again, you can see more of that three-dimensional trim happening here. The lace that's kind of like festooned around the hem of this gown, complementing that Bertha collar again. And then in the fashion illustration on the left-hand side, the three-dimensional flowers, the ruched ribbon again, the bow that goes down her back, all that kind of stuff. Some 1860s hairstyles, again, tends to be parted in the center, smoothed back away from the face, coiled around the base of the neck in braids and buns with some combs and jewels and things in there. Might be held in place with a hairnet called a snood. You can see that in the kind of four images of hairstyles. The bottom right hand one, you can visibly see that hairnet. That's a snood holding it in place. And then I have some portraits of women from this era showing off their hair. They all happen to be in evening hair. So evening hair is going to be fancier than daytime hair. The woman on the top right, her name is Elizabeth. She's the Empress of Austria. Her nickname is Sisi, and she was famous for her hair. She tended to kind of defy convention and wear her hair a little bit longer because she had so much of it, and it was so gorgeous. And she has these beautiful diamond star like hairpins that are studded into this massively thick braid that she's wearing. I wanted to take a moment to discuss mourning dress, mourning with a U, as in I am in mourning for someone who has died. Of course, people have always died and people have mourned them, and lots of times people have dressed symbolically to express their sense of loss and mourning. But this became very codified in the Victorian era, in no small part because in 1861, Queen Victoria's husband died, and that's the same year that her mother died. And so Queen Victoria publicly mourned Albert's death for the rest of her life. So this kind of is a continuation of that romantic era focus on sentiment and big emotions. And then, of course, in America, we have events like the Civil War, where everybody lost someone. So we kind of created a Victorian culture of mourning etiquette. This tended to be observed more closely by women, wherein full mourning for a year and a day, you dressed all in black. And there's a special fabric called crepe. We'll see a picture of it in the next slide, I think. But it was a special kind of material that you really only wore when you were in mourning. And you covered your face with a veil. Widows removed themselves from society during this time. They would just stay at home and go out to church and tend to their husband's grave, and that was it. And in the American South, widows then entered a second mourning after this year and a day for the next year or maybe 2 years. They would wear black gowns and a shorter veil. Everybody else kind of adopted something called half mourning after a period of time. So you could have black with gray or white or purple, or you could wear gray or purple with black trim. You could have a little bit of gold or silver jewelry. But in the South, in America, widows were expected to wear black for the rest of their lives. In the rest of Europe and America, widows could come out of mourning after 2 years and a day. I include this photograph here on the right because it shows a man dressed for mourning. Men were expected to mourn for their wives for 6 months to maybe a year. And they dressed in mourning by wearing a black armband out of crepe on their sleeves. They, of course, continued to work and attend social events and bop about in the real world with just this symbol of mourning in this armband. And women who kind of came out of mourning too early were viewed as immoral hussies. Men could remarry as soon as 6 months after their wife's death. So here are some examples of mourning dress. The dress on the left from about 1845. This is a full mourning dress and bonnet, so she's all in black. In the middle, this is a half mourning dress from about 1890, so you can see it's white or gray with lots of black trim. And on the right-hand side, you can see a mourning bonnet, and you can see this crepe fabric. Can you see how it's very, very crinkly? This is a black silk that has been woven with this crinkle in it. They don't make it anymore, but it was required as part of your outfit when you were officially in mourning. And when you were in mourning, you had to wear mourning specific jewelry. So for full mourning, the acceptable kind of jewelry was black jet. It was black, it was shiny, it kind of got associated with tears, so that was sort of acceptable jewelry for mourning. Also, you could take your loved one's hair and weave it into jewelry like this brooch or on this watch chain here, which would be worn by a man. When you're in half mourning, you can have jet jewelry with a little bit of gold and silver. So this cameo here on the right-hand side has a gold rim around it, so that's for half mourning. So this becomes kind of an entire industry dedicated to the creation of special outfits and jewelry for the grieving process and real social pressure to adhere to it. Also seems to me it places a rather large economic burden on someone who is already going through a loss. But this is what we did in Victorian times. This practice of official mourning like this kind of fell out in the early part of the 20th century. I think perhaps because World War I just created so much loss and grief and death that people were like, yeah, we get it. We're all mourning. Let's move on and figure out something different. Back to pretty stuff. By the late 1860s into the early 1870s, those round hoops that are creating that like circular dome shape are changing. So they're going to kind of flatten out across the front, and the fullness is going to scoot towards the back of the dress. This causes dresses to have more interest in the back than just sort of a round, tent-like structure that's even all the way around. You can see also day bodices beginning to lengthen. If you look at this example here on the left, this green dress, the bodice is coming below the waist with that fringe. And then you can see the fashion illustration in the center, the black outfit on the left and the purple outfit on the right. The bodice is kind of lengthening into an overskirt in some ways. On the right-hand side, you can see an evening gown. Again, we've got that kind of split skirt effect and the looped up ribbon, but you can see all of the flounces in the back on that kind of fancy train that's falling behind her. And fairly quickly, this idea of more interest towards the back changes undergarments entirely, and we end up calling this period of 1870 to 1878 the first bustle period, called the Cascade. You can see what I'm talking about by these fashion illustrations here. The front of the outfit becomes very flat, kind of keeping with where the natural body ends, and then the back of the outfit extends far past the back of the human body. And there's a whole lot of extravagant drapery and decoration going on back there. So this requires a whole new set of undergarments. We get rid of that cage crinoline, and we have something called a cage bustle. You can see it here. Again, we're using that steel or whalebone with fabric to create this shape just at the back. Or you can see this smaller one that's padded horsehair, creating the same effect. Still got our corsets, keeping that hourglass shape, keeping it long over the hips. So here are some day dresses from the first bustle period. I'm trying to show you different angles, so kind of front, back, and side. You can really see where the interest is. So this low square neckline that you might fill it in with a chemisette for day and then leave it out for evening, like this dress here on the right-hand side. Worn right now as it is, without that fill-in, this could be a dinner dress. Um, but you'd want to fill that in with some fabric for the daytime. Bodice might lace up the back or button up the front. You can see that bodice on the left-hand side is lacing up the back. The bodice is expanding past the waist, kind of creating that tailcoat effect over the bustle. And then the skirts are loaded up with trims of all kinds. The overskirt is going to be pulled way back and poofed up to reveal the underskirt that's usually of the same fabric. And they're going to be trimmed in different ways to show off these loops and poofs and folds, as you can see. And then for true evening wear, same silhouette, but again, more exposed shoulders and arms. And in general, lighter, frothier, floatier fabrics. So hairstyles are kind of repeating the look of the dress. You've got a lot more interest in the back. If you think back to 2 slides ago with that photograph of the 2 young women in profile, you can see those big braids and rolls of hair at the back with those little hats kind of perched on tops, kind of angled down over their foreheads. You can see more of that here, how the hair is piled on top of the head at the back and then it's cascading down the neck a little bit. Obviously, not all of this is natural. We're using false hair or pads to help create more volume and intensify the thickness of the braids. You can see a little bit of bangs happening there, especially where they're kind of curled into a fringe across the forehead. As we shift forward a few years, the period from 1878 to 1883 is referred to as the natural form. As you can see, it's a much slimmed down silhouette from the crinoline and the bustle. Very, very narrow form-fitting bodice, very, very narrow skirts. So as this bodice lengthens down over the hips into a real kind of like tight fitting sheath, this is called a cuirass bodice because it's molded to the body down over the hips, kind of like ancient armor, if you think all the way back to our lecture on ancient Roman fashion, right? So as the bodice is doing this, this forces the skirts much closer to the body. And as the skirts begin to narrow, the bustle disappears. And those skirts become so narrow, they're often kind of held in close to the body by ties or tapes or layers of fabric or trim on the outside, and then they flare out below the knee and then into a train at the back. So it's a natural form because it's closer to what the actual human body looks like, although obviously there's quite a bit of underpinning happening to make a very artificial form in this so-called natural form. Voila, here are the artificial understructures that are creating that natural form. You can see how the corset is cut and boned. You can see these little bustle pads that were some options, or a full length bustle with a ruffled petticoat over it to create a foundation for that train. Again, though, much less smaller than the bustle period from the early 1870s. So here you can see an example of that cuirass bodice and the narrower skirts, and then you have this complicated draping that's taking place of interest over all of that volume. You can see kind of like asymmetry is exciting right now, and this kind of more undulating waviness that I suppose is more natural than a uniform, say, applied trim like in the crinoline period. And as the silhouette of the dress slims down, so does the silhouette of the hair. Those big, heavy braids and coils from the bustle period have disappeared, and we're much neater and tighter and closer to the head and more, quote, natural the way the hair is on an actual human. We've got small bonnets and caps still on the head, but now they're perched towards the back of the head as opposed to on the front tilting down. Here's some natural form evening dresses. One popular thing of this period is the so-called princess seam, which means there's no waist seam. It's just vertical seams all the way down the length of the dress. And The bodice in particular is shaped by several long, thin, curved pieces of fabric sewn together to curve out over those hips, etc. As you can see, the skirts in this period are confining the legs by being kind of tied close to the body. And so you have to walk with very tiny feminine steps. But again, this is just the tip of the iceberg as to what is available for fashion tastes. I expect women got very tired of those very narrow skirts really hemming in their stride. So by 1884 until about 1890, we have what we call the second bustle period. So the bustle returns, but this time we're kind of creating a much more rigid shelf, kind of like the thorax of an insect, like a beautiful beetle, if you want to think of it. And over this rigid shelf, the skirts are tailored. Those bodices are going to remain long and close to the body and tailored, and they're going to be then shaped to fit over this bustle. We don't see as much training in the skirts as we did, right? Training means that it extends beyond the foot and then trails on the floor behind you. And as you can see, that bustle pad is really sitting very high on the backside. And another revival that happens here is the Polonaise bodice, if you remember from the Rococo period. Here's that Polonaise bodice on the left-hand side. So you can see the bodice becomes much longer, comes like down to the knee, and then becomes tailored up and poofed back over that bustle, and then the skirt underneath. So here are several examples of different ways to drape and tailor bodice and skirt for this second bustle period. And we see that same trend continuing in the evening gowns for this late bustle period. I said there weren't a lot of trains, and of course I'm showing you gowns with trains. These would be for very formal appearances. And women would then loop the train up into a finger loop on their hand so that they could dance with it. If you remember at the start of this lecture, I mentioned that this was the beginning of the fashion designer. So on the left-hand side here, you can see an evening dress by Charles Frederick Worth, who is considered the first couturier in fashion. And those two smaller dresses in the upper right-hand corner are also from the House of Worth. And that yellow drapey dress in the middle is from Liberty of London. So fashion designers are coming up with specific looks for their house and a certain sensibility, and women are choosing gowns based on the appeal of a particular designer, if they have the budget for it. And now we've reached the last decade of the 19th century, 1890 to 1900. This is the emergence of the so-called New Woman. And so again, we have another silhouette change. Bustles disappear. We're left with bell-shaped skirts with a little bit of gathering or pleating at the back for a little bit of extra fullness. We're back to that hourglass shape. And shoulders are widening again. We are getting more freedom of movement because women are becoming more physically active and more visible in the workplace and engaging in physical activities. So women's wear starts to become more tailored and more practical and a little bit more masculine, if you believe me. And a real style icon of this time is the Gibson girl. You can see a drawing of her on the right-hand side. These were a series of illustrations in magazines by the artist Charles Dana Gibson. They were based on real women, American women who married into British aristocracy, and they were kind of the it girl of the 1890s and early 1900s. So, got to get all new underwear for this new look. Here's an 1890s corset, again, that hourglass shape, but check it out. It's kind of moved down the torso. It doesn't cover the bosom completely, but instead it kind of like pushes the bosom up and out over the top. So you can see that little illustration in the center, these so-called bust improvers to help plump out one's bosom if it doesn't come that way by Mother Nature. And a new shape of petticoat. Again, all of that boning and hooping is gone, but we might stiffen the bottom hem of that petticoat with maybe some horsehair so that it helps hold out that bell shape. So you can see it's a much sleeker, smoother look than what we've been looking at before, streamlined. A lot of that frou-frou stuff has gone away, or at least flattened against the material of the dress itself. So here are some day dresses. You can see about 1892 on the left-hand side, 1895 in the middle, and then I think 98 Am I right? On the right-hand side. So 1897. So the silhouette kind of has this moment, 1895, 1896, where it gets really, really wide across the shoulders, and then it narrows back down again. And one outfit that became popular in the 1890s is called the walking suit. It's a jacket and skirt and blouse, so not dissimilar to a man's suit, right? There may even be a waistcoat in there sometimes. These examples don't have them, but some of them did. But as you can see, this is something a woman would wear out on the street. She could wear it if she worked in an office, which was an acceptable profession for a girl of good family, or if she went visiting or shopping. But it's kind of an out and about outfit. So it's tailored. Um, and as you can see, the sleeves are a little bit full at the beginning, and then they develop this giant proportion 1895, 1896, and then shrink back down again by 1898. Um, this is the leg of mutton sleeve or the gigo sleeve from the 1830s. It's interesting, right? Again, that reminder of King Henry VIII as women's roles are expanding in the public sphere. She's taking up more space with her shoulders. And after decades and decades of that kind of off the shoulder, droopy shoulder look where women can't raise her arms, this is an about face. That big poofy sleeve carries over into evening dresses. Again, we still have that bell hourglass shape. And again, shorter sleeves, lower necklines, and check out the gloves that go all the way up to cover the bare arm and hand. Another innovation for women that came about around this time is the tea gown. This is an item of loungewear or at home wear for women. They could wear it in the morning or they could wear it in the afternoon after they've done their shopping and visiting for the day, but before they've gotten dressed for dinner. And as you can see by these dresses I have pictured here, it's a much looser, less tailored fitting dress. It's sumptuous and beautiful and still kind of following the fashion lines with those big sleeves, etc., etc. But a woman can wear this without her corset on. And so this is a way for her to kind of relax at tea time. So she would wear this alone in her home or with her family. She could receive visitors into her home with a tea gown, but she wouldn't wear a tea gown out of her home to go visit someone else. And as you can see by some of the embroidery here, tea gowns do tend to take on kind of Asian or Middle Eastern or South Asian motifs and patterns. Hair for women in the 1890s, it gets a little bit bigger. We have this thing called the pompadour, again, if you remember from the Rococo period, right? The kind of poof at the front of the forehead and then a big coil at the back. But you can see it's kind of poofing out above the ears all the way around. These hair is kind of rolled up and then held in a knot on the top of the head as well as at the back. And there may be some padding there to help it hold its shape. But it's a very iconic look of the 1890s. Just like men had special outfits to do physical activity in, so did women. Here's some example of some women's sportswear. These are tennis dresses. These women are playing tennis. You can see the skirts are a little bit shorter to help them run on the tennis court. You can see that they're matched with some straw hats, which can be very masculine, a straw boater, like what a man would wear during this time, or you can trim them with feathers and ribbons and flowers, and they can be more feminine. Another popular look for this decade is called the shirtwaist. This is a blouse and skirt combination with a belt. You can see that in the museum piece on the right and then in the photographed center. Very popular among women who worked in factories or offices for a living. It was kind of a wear to work ensemble. Very popular to pair it with a straw flat top hat called a boater. On the left-hand side, you can see this was an outfit made for bicycling, and we know it's a bicycling outfit because it has a split skirt. So it looks like a skirt, but as a woman moves and takes a step, the skirt splits apart, and you can see it's really wide-legged pants. That allows her to ride a bicycle without getting her skirt caught up in the gears. So the legs can be left kind of free like this, or they can get caught up in a band close to the leg again, so they kind of look like knickerbockers or pumpkin bridges. One other item I wanted to bring your attention to, not exclusive to the 1890s, but earlier in the century, something called a wash dress. This is a cotton calico dress, and it's called a wash dress because being cotton and being unboned and unlined and unfoofed, they're very easy to launder. So they're very practical dresses for women who had to do labor, um, and or were, women of lesser means that had fewer dresses and so therefore wanted to make them last longer and so laundered them. And by the 1890s, they were available in ready to wear catalogs like Sears and Montgomery Ward's, for women to purchase so that they didn't have to make them. So I just wanted to remind you, here are some cotton calico dresses, not necessarily wash dresses, but how women of lower economic status could follow fashion trends, but still stick to their budget. So these don't have the big shaped petticoats and bustles underneath there. They might wear those on occasion, or they might not, depending on their means and the occasion. If you're a woman on the frontier running a family farm, you're not going to have a hoop skirt or bustle underneath your dress. Um, but you can still kind of follow the broad strokes of the fashionable silhouette and make your own dress using a pattern from a catalog and calico from the store. Queen Victoria dies on January 22nd, 1901. Her son, Prince Edward, becomes king after her. He is well into middle age by now, and it truly seems to mark an end of an era, a new century, a new monarch over an empire that spans the globe, and new energy in the air. So I leave you with these two images. On the left-hand side is an engraving of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert when they returned from their kind of honeymoon in 1840. And on the right is an 1897 portrait by John Singer Sargent of Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes. And she is really kind of embodying that new woman spirit there. And just look at the way these figures are positioned, male and female gender roles are being perceived by these two artists, and how the fashion is changing, and wonder where we're happening next.